Open banking has been a game changing in the finance industry. It's forcing traditional banks to evolve and providing more opportunities for innovation and startups. Yet, building a fintech product is not for the faint hearted. Navigating the complexity of security, compliance, regulations are just the tip of the iceberg of what startups need to know and worry about. In this episode, I've got Amrit, Lotay, and Jagdeep Bhambra, the co-founders of Mantraverse, and they will share their insights to help you successfully build a fintech product. But first, let me introduce you to my amazing guest. Amrit is a certified product executive from product school in Silicon Valley with over 20 years of industry experience, including startups and scale-ups. As a visionary problem solver, she's passionate about leadership, product, digital transformation, and business architecture. She has been recognized as a leader and a role model for women in business, having been featured on the front cover of a prestigious magazine for women leaders to look up to in 2023. And I can assure you that there's way more accolades to come as well. Jagdeep has worked across a plethora of sectors, across a variety of disciplines, including product management, governance, development, support, operation, data security, architecture, you name it, I'm pretty sure he's done it. He's an established thought leader, mentor, non-executive director, experienced public speaker, and has published numerous works focused on delivering innovative and disruptive products and services. What a bundle of expertise that we have on the show today. I don't know about you, but I'm really excited to dive deeper into the complexities of building fintech products with our amazing guests. Welcome to the Mary Poppins of Startups live show. I'm Naili Makangu from Athena Leaders. As a tech consultant and startup advisor, I will answer live the burning questions that you have on your journeys to Series A+. Subscribe and tune in every week to meet amazing guests, get top tips, and more importantly, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Amrit and Jagdeep, welcome to the show. And I'm really sure that this is going to be kind of a really fantastic discussion. As our guests have heard from the introduction, you both have a lot of experience when it comes to not just the fintech industry, but startup, scale up, and business in general. Could you, Amrit, if you want to start first, kind of introduce yourself a little bit more to kind of, again, allow people to get to know you better?
Yeah, hi, Naili, and thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting us on your podcast as well. So yeah, a bit of background from me. I graduated as an economist. Moving into the tech world was never part of the plan. But yeah, here I am 20 years later, still in tech and thoroughly enjoying it. So I've worked, my first IT job was working for Western Union, and I was there for about 8 years until I took a voluntary redundancy and then moved into various different roles, managing service desks. And then, when things started to become business as usual, it was like, right, now what do I do? So then I moved into the world of IT contracting. And so I started contracting with central government, so a cabinet office, at which point after that I met Jagdeep, and we worked on a Internet of Things project, which was connected cars for Samsung, working with AT&T in the US as well. So that's live in the US. And since then, we've been working on several different projects together, again, back in central government for Ministry of Justice, and then moving into the world of fintech and banking. And so Jagdeep's probably been in that industry a bit longer than I have, but it was just a new industry for me, very exciting. It's one of those places where everyone wanted to be in tech. And still do. So, we've managed to build some e-wallets and banks around the globe. And so, now we started our company Mantraverse. And as part of Mantraverse, we are working on several different projects in fintech and banking, NFT marketplaces, property tech, insurtech, media and sports tech, health tech. That's me in a nutshell.
Brilliant, thank you. And Jagdeep, do you mind also introducing yourself to our audience?
Yes, of course. So once upon a time, did a PhD in toxicology of all things, and been in the IT and various associated disciplines for about 25 years now. More recently, as Amrit mentioned, we've been working currently in the fintech and banking sector like myself. I've actually worked across multiple sectors and industries, including defense, working with central government, local governments, sports, media, publishing, telco. And yeah, the last 4 to 5 years I've been working mainly in the Middle East, delivering a few e-wallets and challenger banks as well. As Amrit mentioned, we've recently kicked off another company that we have, Mantraverse. We've got some very good experience in terms of setting up companies such as startups, but also working with scale-ups and enterprise and corporates as well. So we're not too worried about the size of the organization. The main aim is to deliver quality, how to reduce total cost of operations, increase return on investment. But we are not to BAU. So that's probably the one thing that we don't do is operational stuff or babysitting. It's more delivery, innovation, getting things out of the door, and making things happen. So yeah, that's us.
I think you just picked the exciting parts of the marketing of the innovation. Really, it's really like that part where there's a seed. Whether, as you said, we in Mantraverse is not just for startup; it could be for an enterprise. But even then, there's always, especially right now, this need of innovating. You don't innovate, you stay behind. And I see that's quite a lot in the fintech world. One of the things that I'm getting quite excited about is the new possibilities and also the fire that's being put underneath the traditional banks to also start thinking about what do we do next. So how do you both see the fintech landscape right now? Do you think that is becoming oversaturated, or there's still a lot of opportunities for new people out there that have an idea and a passion in fintech world to kind of start something?
Yeah, I mean, I can go with that one. So yes, it is saturated in many places, but that doesn't stop new fintechs from sort of entering the market. I think there is plenty for everyone, but it's just finding that unique idea or that unique solution for a problem that makes it easier for customers around the world. And I think also because we've worked with banks and e-wallets around the world, it also depends on the region as well. So, for example, in the Middle East, they're looking to the West to try and understand, how they can build products and have solutions. But they're also catching up from a regulatory perspective. They're catching up on, moving from manual ways of working to more digital solutions, and that takes time. So they are a little bit behind, and each region has its own, challenges. And so I think there are some emerging markets. There's, if you look at Africa, if you look at the Middle East, even South America, they're all trying to enter the fintech space, looking at the UK for advice and guidance as well.
Yeah,
and I think
it's a good point. Yeah, go ahead, Jagdeep.
Yeah, sorry, I was say, just to complement what Amrit said is, fintech is one thing, but we also have to be conscious of consumer behavior, because in the UK, for example, on how we consume financial products and services is very different to the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, etc. as well. So what we've seen in terms of experiences is that in many scenarios, companies, individuals have tried to copy and paste from one region to another, but it hasn't worked. And the main reason is because they've missed out on either user research, market research, competitor research, but also the behavior on how individuals consume financial services and the maturity of financial services as well within that region. So cultural behavior is very important to be able to appreciate as well. So you might introduce a cutting edge fintech product, but if the uptake is very poor, or you've missed the cultural usage on how people consume financial services, then you've kind of you've lost that as well. So I think the good news is that from the experiences that we've had is we're very aware on how culturally people consume these services, and that kind of helps the innovation side, because that's where you identify the gap. In many cases, I think the common element in all the stuff that we've done so far is introducing financial inclusion and financial awareness. So you kind of almost drip feed a particular aspect in, and then as you see the uptake, you start introducing other aspects. So this kind of lends itself to kind of delivering MVPs into market, and then building and iterating on that functionality, which means you're more likely to get money coming in sooner rather than later, number one. But also people get familiar with what you're trying to introduce, And a year down the line, once you're live, then you can start introducing slightly more innovative products, which might end up disrupting the behavior itself. And that's kind of what we've seen. I think with the fintech landscape generally, I think part of the reason it exists is because the banking infrastructure, as Amit mentioned earlier, is very behind. And similarly in the UK, had the banks been very fast and innovative and rapid to deliver services, products in the market in a way consumers can actually use in a friendly behavior, then that fintech sector would actually be less strong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I see that as well. Actually, so I spend a lot of time in Spain and also in the UK, and it's interesting to see the difference in the way technology, especially when it comes to banking, has evolved. I mean, in Spain they are catching up, but I spend way more time going to the bank to do things that I will just grab my phone and do when I'm back home. But also new ideas are coming out. One of the really nice feature that's to simplify transaction is just to pay someone via their mobile phone, which is something that we don't do a lot in the UK. So it's interesting, to see the differences even just in Europe. So you can imagine when you go further in Middle East, in Africa, and Latin America, then becomes even more important when you start thinking about their adoptions and how people react to the product as well. You both mentioned this idea, MVP and starting up in a fintech product. Now, this is a question that a lot of people do ask, whether it's on forums or when I do a demonstration with people. There's this, I wouldn't call it fear, but it's a bit kind of overwhelming feeling that starting in fintech is probably not the cheapest industry out there to start because there are just so many things to worry about, right? We're talking about regulation, compliance, and so much more. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. So I think in terms of the delivering a fintech proposition to the market, to your point earlier, it depends what you've decided as your proposition to the market. And depending on that, that will determine the cost. Typically, in the UK, for example, there's a variety of financial licenses you can apply for, and they vary in pricing. And then similarly, in other countries, you don't have to go for the major, large licenses. And this is where the concept of MVP comes in. So if I use a kind of a very lightweight example and a kind of a layman's example, is that if we decide, let's say, hypothetically, in an emerging market to build a digital bank, let's say, rather than going for a digital banking license at the onset, which will cost an arm and a leg, and it also means that you have to prove to the regulators that you are ready to become a digital bank, that entire overhead will cost you a ton of money. And also you're increasing the risk of non-delivery because as you introduce more and more features and no money's coming in, you're also drawing down on your bank balance as well. So the alternative would be to basically do this in a stage-by-stage process, which is go for the cheapest license possible that allows you the entry into the market, which may be something like an e-wallet license or an EMI license as an example. And then once you're in the market, you can then establish yourself internally to become that digital bank and then evolve yourself to the point that you can then apply for the right license. And hopefully by then you've got the footprint that allows the regulators to approve and give you that license, which de-risks that entire process. So that's an example where you don't necessarily need to go for the big licenses. That may be your aspiration, but it's that step-by-step process. And that's a typical example on how to do things. If, on the other hand, you want to remain in e-wallet, but you want to introduce increasing functionality, features, services, etc., into your proposition, then go for the slimmest one, which will at least allow you entry into the market. It may allow you to at least get a foot in the door, proverbially speaking, and then you can increase in terms of what you're looking at. The caveat to that is your USP might be the license that requires a lot of money, in which case that's kind of where you have to manage risk and decide how you're going to get on that journey to deliver that market. So I think the positive side is that in most countries now, you've got a variety of different licenses you can apply for, so you don't necessarily need to go for the ones that cost the most. But then secondly is to also appreciate the journey that you want to take in order to get to where you are. Typically, if you break it into bite-sized chunks, it's much more digestible. It's a far better story to tell investors, the board, and people who've got vested interest, and also the regulators will be far more comfortable with that risk profile as well if they see that you've thought about it and it's a staged process. It also means you can deliver from a technology perspective, for example, the right tech at the right time, rather than having to build everything upfront and front load everything, which is kind of, personally speaking, where I've seen a few odd disasters here and there where things have been front loaded and nothing's actually been achieved. But yeah, I think that the word of, I think that kind of phrase MVP gets banded around quite a lot, but I think in this case it's actually very, very relevant that you need to be very sharp about what you can actually get into the market as an MVP.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's not just about the cost itself, it's also about time. It takes time to apply for these licenses as well, so that needs to be factored in. And as we know, time is money. So just keep that in mind, that it's not an easy process. You have to make sure that you tick off everything from a regulatory perspective. You're making sure that you know how you're handling all the data and everything that comes around with that. And then also making sure you can verify and validate your customer base as well correctly. So there's lots to think about, and it's not something that you can just get out to market very quickly. From experience, we've seen that people are they want to do something new, and they want to be better than their competitors. But what they end up doing is trying to build everything to launch so that they can stand out from day one. And that's very hard, and it takes a lot of time as well.
And a considerable amount of money to be able to do that as well.
Exactly, yeah. You need the resources, and yeah, that can really pile on the costs very quickly.
So what is your advice for companies that are already kind of established in a country? You kind of mentioned that a little bit, but if you wanted to go further afield, what is your advice to start to help companies to start understanding the regulations, and also, as you were talking about, the customer experience that they will face there, which is different than where they started from?
I would say one is get the right people in your team who understand the region, who've ideally been there and done it. In many cases, I wouldn't underestimate the power of research. So research is very important. Expertise is very important, especially around navigating regulations, navigating what you need to do in terms of how to get over the line. Majority of the regions place a lot of emphasis in terms of AML, fraud, counterterrorism screening, etc., PEPs and sanctions. And majority of the time, you will not go live unless you have these checks in place. And that's exceedingly important as well in terms of making sure that you're ticking off the regulatory side, ultimately because you're working in a regulated sector. So you can't skimp on those particular elements either. I would say in terms of advice, expertise is very important, but the expertise can be had without having to go to the large system integrators and consultancies as well, because in many cases they will utilize people like myself to come in. So expertise is available. Thankfully, we live in the world of LinkedIn, etc., where you can get access to individuals and organizations that can specialize, and niche boutiques which can offer that advice and guidance in order to navigate some of these legislations. The good news, based upon my experience, especially if you look at kind of Middle East, Europe, UK, working in Dubai, Bahrain, etc., is majority of the legislations and regulations that exist in all these regions, they're not too far different from each other. And I would say, again, just based on experience, they're probably at 85 to 90% similar anyway. So you're not talking about two different. Majority of the cases, the differences are usually to do with things like data sovereignty, data residency, who can access the data, when and how. In other cases, you might be limited to some of the technology platforms you can and can't use. Some countries don't have cloud infrastructures or don't allow public cloud. In other cases, public cloud is allowed for fintech use, etc. So again, these are minor differences in the large scheme of things. But what I would say is ensure that you're working with people who can make things simple for you. And that's kind of very important, because the simpler things are, the easier they are to digest, and the easier they are to present to regulators and legislators as well. And that's typically rule of thumb is keep it simple, and the art and the skill of doing this correctly is to present a very complex ecosystem in a simple way so people understand what you're talking about. That also gives a bit more confidence to investors and the board as well, that ultimately they have a team that can deliver this in a confident way.
Yeah, and that's also a good advice, for even pitching, because sometimes I've been in pitch situations where the idea is great, but it takes a while for people in the room to even understand what they're saying because it's way too technical. So how do you package something complex like your fintech product, even if you go like these different stages that you mentioned earlier, as well as understanding the market and then talking to people. And the second thing I love about what you said is as well is another thing I see a lot is people being very reluctant to ask for help because they want to hide their amazing idea away, whilst at the same time not asking for help, especially when you're crossing into a new market, could be something that also push you backwards even more so than you think.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think also some products, like for example crypto, in some regions that's you can't get a crypto license, so you've got to really understand your market well. And also the other thing to remember is that from a regulation perspective, things change. So you need to make sure that your solution can adapt to any regulatory changes quite easily. One thing we found in the Middle East is, as the first fintech launched there, which we were part of, one thing that really became apparent was that the regulatory side of things is catching up. So every time they introduce a new regulation, fintechs they have to adapt very quickly. So yeah, the solution has to be easy to sort of adapt based on these changes that will keep coming about.
Yeah. And again, this is why people really need to kind of look into Mantraverse if they're thinking about building a fintech, just because of all of those complexities. Now, one of the other things that a lot of questions people have when it comes to fintech products, especially right now, where the possibilities for integration and getting the source of data or banking information is pretty much limitless. It's how do you even start thinking about APIs and integration? Is it something that you need to bear in mind earlier on in the process, or is it something that comes much later? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. So I think typically how I've operated in majority of the banks, e-wallets, etc. And actually, to be fair, it's multi-sector. It's not just specific to fintech and banking. Is when you come to architecting, because ultimately that's kind of where my background is in the architecture space, is your platform is only as good as how it can glue into other system services and how you can surface the right data at the right time to the right people with the right permissions. So with that in mind, thankfully in today's world of tech, you've got a ton of tools at your disposal, everything from proprietary tools all the way down to open source. And it varies in terms of the reasons you would want to use these. So typically, when we're building these systems and services, there's a set of security principles, architecture principles, design principles, data principles. And what you do is construct these to make sure that at least there's a guidance for anyone in the tech, and actually even on the kind of business and the softer side in the business, to make sure that they understand how we can access data, how we can service the data, how we can manipulate that data, transform it, etc. So APIs, yes, it's kind of goes without saying in today's kind of tech ecosystem that yes, you do need to design an API microservices friendly architecture. But then it also depends on the nature of the legislations, the nature of the technology choices you have available. In some cases, your ideal scenario may not be able to actually transpire because you're limited in terms of what you can do from a technology, legislative, geographic perspective. And you have to work your way around that, which is kind of where the experience comes in. And in some scenarios, you may not want to use proprietary because ultimately, the organization might be very keen to kind of generate IP, and usually rule of thumb is the quickest way to generate IP from a tech perspective is to utilize open source with the correct licenses, and so you have to kind of navigate this. But yes, APIs are very important. Integration is very important. The aim is to make sure that the integration is very lightweight, so not tightly coupling systems. And in many cases, we've used open source, proprietary, like I said. But you have to be conducive that your platform is subject to change, because as your business model evolves, your tech platform and your tech ecosystem has to evolve, and alongside that, your people and processes has to evolve as well. So you're almost kind of making sure that it's kind of a moving ecosystem rather than and it's very organic. The big issue in many scenarios, especially if you look at some of the traditional banks, I mean, when I'm talking about traditional banks, I'm highlighting the word traditional, is that their tech ecosystem is almost stagnated now because it can't evolve at the speed that the services are kind of expected to be released, and also the consumer behaviors change so quickly. So you don't want to create like an architecture or technology landscape that's like treacle. So it has to rapidly adapt as well. In some cases, you also have to make sure that you can swap vendors, suppliers, partners out as well, because for various reasons, you might decide that you want to swap one tech for another. You might decide to move one vendor out for to another, because, and it could be a variety of reasons. It could be commercial, technical, it could be political, geographic, etc. And so that's kind of plug and play architecture is very important nowadays as well. Where you do have access to cloud, in some cases, you look at the non-functional requirements when you're designing systems. It depends on how portable you want the system to be as well, because I've worked in certain scenarios where you're looking to cookie cut an architecture from one geography to another in terms of reducing the total cost of operations and increasing return on investment. So it makes sense to create an architecture in such a way that you can almost lift and shift it into another geography, 80% or 50%, depending on how you've designed it. And in those particular scenarios, you can't vet yourself, and you need to be very conscious about things like vendor lock-in as well. That you don't set yourself up for failure later on by kind of getting in bed with one particular vendor that you can't come out of. So exit strategies are very important as well. So I know there's a ton of stuff which I've mentioned. Everything's pretty much important, but it goes down to the point that yes, you should be able to have the ability to allow data to be ingested in a very easy and quick way, and similarly, you should be able to push data out in a fast and slick manner as well, and be conscious of what data you're pushing and what data you're receiving as well. And ultimately, you have to transform and manipulate that data internally. So those processes have to be in place as well. Usually, when architecting these kind of systems, you do have to go through a process in a slightly more traditional manner, because although you want to deliver something very fast and very quick, there is a lot of strategic thinking that needs to happen. So it's almost like a paradox that you can't go quick and dirty, because quick and dirty will bite you later on, commercially and otherwise. So it's almost, although we talk about agile is in context of what you're trying to deliver in terms of adaptability. And sometimes there is a bit of a waterfall process that comes in place, because you do need to think about these in a very kind of a strategic, long-term manner as well, depending on what the exit strategy is for the particular company that I'm working for.
Yeah, and that I love that you mentioned about the agile versus waterfall. As I worked in a fintech before, and some of the challenges that you've mentioned resonate with me as well. They say, especially when you're working and integrating with other clients' platforms, and they believe that agile means that we can just move a certain way. But when you have a fintech product, as you've mentioned, there are some steps that we cannot go or we cannot ignore, like the data ingestion. What does it mean? If we don't do it well, what are the implications in the future? And sometimes whatever we built for the ingesting data might work for one company, but it needs to be tweaked for another one. So all of those kind of things are surprises that sometimes I find that new people in the fintech sector or new founders might not think about when they're at the very beginning, because they just something that we look at later on. But then yes, it's important to kind of bear that in mind early on. So the question I also want to continue on this, when you mentioned this integrating with vendors and partners, that's also another thing that's quite exciting in a way, because there's the one-way integration, which is fine. If they have an open API, there's things that can be done. But if you wanted a two-way integration, and that's when starting to create partnership becomes another thing that people need to think about. So I don't know if you have experience when it comes to not just from the technology side of things, but when you start strategically think about approaching vendors to start creating partnerships, whether it's for integrations or for other aspects of the business.
Sorry, Jagdeep, you gonna go?
No, I was going to say it's probably worth you answering this one.
Okay, yeah. So I think it's really important to make sure that, you know, whoever you partner with, that you share sort of the same vision and the same goals. You know, you're going to be communicating with each other for a very long time, so there needs to be transparency. It is, you know, something that you have to really evaluate who you're going to partner with, because yeah, this potentially could be a long-term partnership. But at the same time, I think Jag mentioned earlier in the conversation is that you need to understand what exit looks like as well, because a lot of people don't focus on that side. But when things either go wrong or it's time to part ways, you know, people don't really fully understand what that exit looks like. So that's something that should be discussed early on as well. But as I said, communication, it needs to be clear between, you know, the partners that you're selecting. And they have to have like complementary skills. There's no point in partnering with somebody who does exactly the same thing as you. Yeah, so it's important to select the right partners for your fintech. Yeah, and regular communication, collaboration needs to be key. And the other thing around partnerships is to make sure that you have done your evaluation. And also, if you are going to go and expand your fintech globally, that you know, your partner can come with you as well, because there have been cases where, you know, you have to find different partners in different regions as well. So yeah, and Jag has a lot of experience with evaluating, you know, vendors, suppliers, partners, in all the fintechs we've worked in. So, and it is, you know, I have to compliment him on his patience, you know, making sure we pick the right people to work with.
Yeah, I think, yeah, just on the concept of partner, I think that word itself needs to be explained in some scenarios, because when you say partner, it's somebody who basically assumes a level of risk with you on the journey, hence the term partner. And and that's part of the understanding that they will pull out the stops for you where it's needed. And building that trust, that relationship is very important with partners as well. Because ultimately, if you end up on a purely commercial relationship, then that creates a havoc in its own way. Because ultimately, the aim of getting partners on board is to distribute the risk in a good way, which means you can collectively own the risk and make things happen. And in many cases, where I've worked, some partners have worked, some haven't. But the idea is it's an evolving process, because you're never going to get anything 100% right. But thankfully, you know, over the 15, 20 plus years that I've kind of been in positions to design systems, services, products, etc., is that you build your own network of people you want to work with, and the partners that who are willing to kind of pull out the stops for you when it matters to get things over the line. Because ultimately, everyone's reputation is on the line. Everybody needs to make something happen. Everybody's got the same drive and the passion to deliver and avoid failure where possible. So yeah, to Amrit's point, it's not an easy thing to find the right partners, vendor, suppliers. In the last few roles which I've worked in, we've had partners across multiple geographies, you know, America, Canada, Dubai, India, Portugal, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, you name it. You know, it's literally because it's kind of a huge kind of ecosystem of vendor, suppliers, and partners. But the skill comes in how do you kind of manage all the vendor, suppliers, and partners that work, so they work together as a unit, and they become greater than the sum of their parts. And that's kind of where the skill and experience comes in. So, you know, it's one of those things I can happily tell you what the formula is and the list of ingredients, but ultimately you have to have the experience as a chef to make the dish taste well. That's kind of the analogy. So typically, that's kind of where the experience comes in, which is why even personally, if somebody has you know, some experience in this space, I'm always willing to learn, because it's a learning process, and you learn from others as well. And the vendors, partners, suppliers also share their experiences as well to say, potentially this will work there, so this won't. So you have to keep your ego in check, because even partners, vendors, and suppliers also bring their own experience to the table. And in many cases, you might have a particular view, but they may tell you something that alters that view in a good way, which means you don't want to replicate the same problems again. So you have to be open to listen to advice and guidance. And ultimately, the reason you bring people on board into projects is because you value their expertise, and there's no point bringing somebody who's very good and not listening to them, or somebody who has experience and not listening to them, because you've lost out yourself as an individual. So although I might be in a very senior capacity, in the teams and companies, you always have to listen to advice and guidance as well, and then make a judgment call as to whether you take that on board and go with it, or you assume a level of risk to decide on an alternative path as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you both for this answer, and definitely love the analogy of cooking. As just reminding me of a really bad Thai meal I had yesterday. They had all the right ingredients and they followed the recipe, but I think they needed a bit more experience and had the right chef to come in as well. We do have a question that came in from Mary Olubukola Adeleye. How early should you start thinking about the global market and how to expand the business beyond your local market?
I would say, in terms of thinking globally, ultimately what you want to do is introduce as many areas to tick off as possible earlier in the conversation, but then you have to make a judgment call as to whether that's actually viable and when you can actually do that. But ultimately, you need to make sure that you've established in your particular geography before you start thinking globally. So it's one of those kind of examples where it's fine to eat the entire pizza. I'm going to use a food analogy again. It's great to eat the entire pizza, but you have to start with one slice at a time. And similarly with kind of thinking about global expansion, have that in the back of your mind. Make sure that you're always aware that you want to expand globally, but don't jump ahead. Make sure you're taking the steps correctly and establish yourself as a brand within whichever respective geography or region you're in. And then once you've established yourself, then by all means, think globally. But if you look at different pillars within an organization, if you're looking at global expansion, then one thing I would say is introduce that as a non-functional requirement to say that you want to design the platform that allows for a bit of copy and paste across multiple regions. If you're thinking about vendors, partners, and suppliers, you can think about the ones that will help you work globally as well. But in some scenarios, you might not be able to find partners and vendors and suppliers that can work globally. So you have to make that judgment call each time, but have this in the back of your mind. So that's kind of, I know it's a bit of a fluffy answer, but I would say, yes, definitely think about it, definitely introduce it into the strategy. By all means, that's fine. And very early on, have that as part of your overall kind of aim and goal for your organization, but don't try and hit that without establishing yourself.
Yeah.
Goes back to what you were saying earlier, sorry, Amrit, just what you're saying earlier about the different steps that you have to have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great to think about the bigger picture right at the start, but don't attempt to go into every region at the same time. There's going to be variations in all the regions you enter. There's going to be differences in processes, regulation, but it's important to get it right in your local region first. Make sure you've got the user experience correct, the user interface correct, everything works. And then once you've, like Jagdeep said, once you have established your brand, it then makes it easier to go into different regions, but you really have to understand the local market well. So whichever region you are going in, make sure you've done your user research, make sure there is actually a problem there that you're trying to solve, know who your competitors are, understand, what the cultural differences are in the different regions you're trying to target. But yeah, I would emphasize research as much as possible. But yeah, don't try and attempt to eat the whole pizza in one go, as Jag said.
Yeah, and I'm loving the food analogy. And I guess Bhagat Singh on the chat has also put something about eating whole thing stuffed crust. So I guess, all I'm going to start using that as well. Food analogy always works. We do get the message. And and again, just to add to Mary, I don't have any more advice to share because I think Jagdeep and Amrit has done it beautifully. And if you've only just joining the live broadcast right now, then I will also advise that you go back at the beginning because there was a lot of discussion in terms of they went into a lot more details as well in terms of the global market and things to bear in mind. And as long as as they both said very nicely, don't just be tempted to just eat the whole thing at the same time. Now, one thing that I'm sure some people know, some people don't, is that Amrit and Jagdeep, you've been working together for quite a while, as you've mentioned, and there are many businesses and startups that you've done before. And of course, for me as an interviewer, I love interviewing co-founders, and I love to see how you bounce nicely with each other. What is your secret to building a strong co-founder relationship that stands the test of time?
Sorry.
Carry on.
I was just going to say that.
Sorry, carry on. This is part of having a good co-founder, is that we say the same thing at the same time.
We like to talk over each other. Yeah, we like to talk over each other, and I'm always right. That's a recipe. No, I think it's making sure that you complement each other's skills. If we were both really good at, I don't know, like, Jag's like a superman when it comes to the tech side of things, and if I had exactly the same skills as him, we'd probably clash. We probably wouldn't be able to make decisions as well as we could, and that goes for the whole team. You really have to make sure that you choose your co-founders wisely, and I think because we have worked together over several years, we've kind of found that sweet spot. We don't step on each other's toes. We know what each other is good at. We take advice from each other, and at the end of the day, this is your co-founders are with you in the long run. So when things go bad, you need to make sure that you have a good supportive team around you to carry you through, and I think that's what we have. We have that the banter, we have the skills, and we've all worked with each other for a very long time, and I think that's really what makes up a really good co-founding team.
Yeah, I think the underlying aspect of this also is, and this is kind of, again, part of the professional integrity, is that you have to maintain honesty, your integrity and your professionalism. There's no substitute for actually working with people who've been under pressure, and then you see how people really operate under pressure. And once that pressure is on, people's true personality and nature comes out. So as Amrit mentioned, we've worked with each other on multiple projects. We understand how we work under pressure and how we operate on particular projects. So the good news is that we're aware of what people can and can't do. And similarly, even the teams that we have that kind of work with us, because ultimately we're only as good as a team that supports us. We've worked with them, and we understand how they operate, how they work, personalities, characters, etc. And that ability to basically release pressure when you need to, have a chat, switch off, have a conversation, etc., is very valuable. From my perspective, personally speaking, as long as you maintain your honesty, integrity, and professionalism, you don't know who your next co-founder might be, because this is a key thing. Amrit and I, for example, never planned to be co-founders of any company. It's the fact that we've worked together, and even Mantraverse, similarly, the team that we have, it wasn't planned that we would create Mantraverse. It happened organically as a result of people working together and understanding. But the commonality between everybody is that the honesty, integrity, and professionalism is there from onset, and that will always maintain itself regardless of the pressure that you're under. And as long as you have that, then you're not worried about pressure breaking people or pressure straining relationships, etc., which is very important. Similarly, one of my other companies, Realitech, which I run with Niels since 2015, we've gone through ups and downs on that. But again, we're reciprocating exactly the same thing, is that the honesty, professional integrity, you have to maintain it. In some scenarios, we've actually lost contracts because of our honesty. But you've maintained the relationships that matter, and that's kind of how we operate. So like I said earlier, Mantraverse wasn't planned, Startups Hub was not planned. It's something that transpired as a result of experience and working together. So I think Amrit, I'm sure, can share some horror stories to co-founders she's worked with previously. But from my personal perspective, where co-founders don't work well is when there's a misalignment in terms of people's vision, views, passion, and what you're expecting out of that relationship as well, and that engagement. So we have to, it's one of those things that as long as you understand that there may be personal differences, etc., but as long as there's common ground enough for you to cooperate and build something, then you can do magic, and that's kind of how we like to work as well. Like one point I made earlier is that you don't know who your next co-founder is going to be and how you're going to operate and work, but as long as you maintain your credibility, because it doesn't take much for you to break your professional integrity. It takes a second, and you can't recover from that either. So it's one of those things that you might be able to make a lot of money, but you can't put a price on dignity and professionalism and integrity. And as long as you're maintaining those more kind of, I would say, more philosophical aspects of your personality and character, then that shines through, and then you will attract the right people to you as well. Because I believe personally that if your personality, your character will attract people around you who are of similar mindset. And similarly, the people who are opposing that or an antithesis of that will avoid you. So one way to maintain, good relationships is to be, maintain your credibility as well.
That's really lovely. One question I've got for Amrit. Of course, we've got a couple of more interesting questions in the chat, but before we get on to them, you've mentioned, obviously bad experiences of co-founders in the past, and of course, I'm sensitive about the issue, however much you want to discuss about that on the show. But one key question is, how do you move forward, right? Once you've invested a lot of time and possibly money into a venture with a co-founder that doesn't work out. So how do you kind of get out of that situation and move forward?
Yeah, I think it's all very exciting at the start of the journey. You're excited about this new project or this new venture. You're putting all of your time and effort into it, and things are going well. It's just when something doesn't quite go right, say for example, in one of the experiences I've had, the ideas being great, the execution, the prototypes being great. It's got to the investor stage where investors are, keen to invest, but actually nothing transpires, nothing actually gets signed. And that puts pressure on because you've been working on this idea for a long time, again, in a highly regulated industry. You have to get the right licenses, it costs money. And then the pressure comes because, you can't finally get the investor to part with their money. And at that time, you really start to see people's true colors, how they handle pressure, how that changes the environment you're working in. And at that time, that's when you start to think, okay, I'm putting all the effort in, the environment's becoming very toxic. You try to help, bring this back into a more motivational environment. You try and get the team back into the same space again, but, it's sometimes a downhill spiral. And one of the ventures I was working on happened to be over COVID. So there were also other factors, things were changing. People weren't allowed to go out anymore or meet, the regular people you would meet. Investors were afraid to, part with their money during that time as well. The pressure really came on. And at that time, you can't always control the external environment. But what you can do is try and keep each other motivated. But there comes a point where you realize that actually this isn't moving in the right direction, or it's actually affecting you and your ability to do other things as well. It's having an impact on other areas of your life. And that's when you start to realize that you've got to make a decision. Is this the best place for you to be? Is it time to move on? What does that look like? You start thinking about the time you've invested, the money you've invested, and all sorts of thoughts come through your mind. But in the end, you have to make the best decision for yourself. And at which point, in one of these ventures, I decided to take an exit, and that was after 2 years. So I was, in there full time for 2 years, didn't earn a penny, put money in, but the environment just became so toxic that I had to make that decision for myself. And I'm glad I did, because, I felt so much better, and I got my mojo back after leaving. You don't realize how much of an impact it has on you in a negative way until you're out of the environment. But yeah, do try and make it work first. And if you start to see actually, this isn't quite working or going the way you expect, then you have to make the best decision for yourself.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. And I mean, I love what you said about the sunken cost, because sometimes people continue with the ride even when after the point where they know I've done my best, I've tried it all I could, and this is not right for me. You start thinking about, as you've mentioned, the time, the money invested, and the passion. But if it's get to the point where you're not aligned anymore and or is affecting you personally, then yes, that's the right move to make. Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions. So the first one is from Baghat Singh. In a fast-paced environment, how do you manage customer expectations when everyone wants results immediately?
Okay. So I think one is making sure that you understand the behaviors of your customers. You understand, how things are changing. So, for example, in the fintech space, there's lots of competitors launching new products, and you're trying to keep up with all of that. But is it really solving the problem for the customer? And that's where you have to make sure that you're doing your research. And I always say to all the startups I've worked with as well, make sure you get your customers involved right from the start, so they go along the journey with you, and they become sort of ambassadors and advocates for your product. And that really helps because you're designing your product for them, and they will give you valuable feedback. They will give you insights that are going to be, that are going to probably help you accelerate faster than your competitors. A lot of companies leave that part out because they've got a great idea and they want to run with it, but they forget that, there's a customer at the end of this who's going to use that product, and it has to solve a problem for them. It might be a great, fantastic, innovative idea, but if it doesn't solve a problem, no one's going to use it. So I think the key to this is making sure that you're keeping your customers going along the journey with you and really taking their insights and feedback on board.
I think one of the key aspects here in terms of a principle is communication. So you have to keep that communication channel open with your customers, whether it be before your product is released to the market or after. And in some cases, it's the customer service that actually creates a failure. So you might have a fantastic product, but if your customer service is atrocious, people will move on, despite how good that product or service might be. So communication is very important, and it has to be two-way as well. If customers have a high demand and expectation, as long as they understand that you're communicating with them, that expectation can be managed, because you can understand, or they know that there's a channel into that particular box where their feedback, their views are taken into account. And even if you're responding to them to say, yes, we've taken it on board, that even a simple statement like that alleviates a lot of headaches for parties on both sides. It's when all of us as consumers of various products and services, it's very frustrating when you try and get some information, or whether you want to provide information, but you're hitting a brick wall. But the moment you get any feedback, there's a level of alleviation of that stress and frustration. So similarly, when you're on the other side, actually delivering products and services to the market, you have to be conscious that your customers have the same behavior you do when you hit a brick wall, and you want to avoid that scenario happening to your customers as well. The more engaged they feel, the better that expectation is. And even if you say, okay, some customers are asking for something that is very immediate, as long as you manage their expectations by communicating to them, and you might be a simple statement that, yes, we've taken it on board and we can't do it now, but we'll do it later, or it'll happen, in 3 months' time, 6 months' time. It's part of our roadmap, for example, etc., depending on the context of the discussion. That at least that feedback back to the customer has kind of reduced that stress and angst as well from that perspective. And like I said, some of the products and services that we've worked on, some of our areas of work has been on the customer service side, because ultimately anything that you put into market, it'll spend majority of its lifespan in the operational world and being utilized by your end customer, whether they be B2C, B2B, B2B2C, B2 government, etc. Otherwise, but whatever individual, company, etc., that's consuming your services, they need that customer service there. And the better that becomes, the more likely your product is to maintain its reputation as well. Because the worst thing you can do in terms of damaging your reputation in the market is not responding to customer feedback or managing customer expectations.
Yeah, just one more thing to add to that. So you can also publish roadmaps as well. So you can have public-facing roadmaps so your customers can see what's coming next. And the other way to do it is when you're launching new features, you can also have a voting from your customers as well, so that they feel that they're heard, and that they're voting for the next feature, and that sort of keeps them excited, engaged, and heard as well.
And just to add to that, I would say if you actually even merge everything, the communication, how you speak to them. I love the voting features. I think that's also very important, because when people know that they've been heard and something is coming, they're a lot more patient. But if I just use one word to also that I would like to add is honesty. And this is something that Jagdeep, you've mentioned quite a lot, honesty and professionalism, because I've been on projects where the reason why I was invited to work with the team was because of the strained relationship between the customer, especially when we're talking B2B. And one of the things that people forget, especially when we are talking integration and B2B, is that you might have a problem in your company or a scale up, for example, and you are going through the challenges of hiring quickly, of building in the culture, and so much more. But bearing in mind that even your clients could be in large organizations, but they also have their own internal politics and other issues that comes in. So using pretty much everything that's been shared to answer this question, and adding a level of honesty on there as well, will help you to smooth things over. So the final question that we have is from Mary again. What sort of protection can you put in place for a fintech to protect your innovation, especially when you are solving a global problem but launching in a part of the world?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's you have to take this in terms of relativity, and what I mean by that, it needs to be relative of what you're trying to solve as a problem. But there are many mechanisms in terms of protecting yourself. One is trademarking. You can create patents, IP, etc. And it's not a cheap process. Trademarks cost money. There's a kind of pretty lengthy process in terms of evaluation, due diligence. Myself, for example, I've got my own pet projects which I'm running with my own kind of private company, and I've filed for quite a few trademarks and patents, etc. And it takes time. But ultimately, if you're conscious that you want to protect your brand, you want to protect your innovation, you want to protect what you're putting out to market, then there's mechanisms in place. It also depends on the nature of the industry you're operating on. So within the fintech space, for example, patenting is kind of one option, but chances are you're not going to get global patents for a lot of stuff nowadays, especially because point made very early on in the conversation was that the fintech market in some regions is very saturated. Trademarks, obviously, can kind of protect your brand and what you're trying to get at as a particular proposition. IP, if you're building on open source, or if you're building a unique proposition, then there's ways to create intellectual property that can be protected through legal mechanisms. Whether you can enforce it or whether you need to go down litigation if someone breaches is another question. Because ultimately, if somebody does breach, one of your trademarks or IP, etc., it's not a cheap process to go through litigation and actually kind of nail people proverbially for breaching what they've done. So you have to be conscious about what you want to protect, how you want to protect, and there is a commercial element to this as well that you need to be very conscious about. I know it's a bit of a loose answer, but I think it's without understanding what you're trying to do, it's very difficult to answer that at a very generic level, which is hence my answer being very generic. But if you drill down more specifically in terms of what you're trying to do at a global level, there are mechanisms in place, but to help you, because caveat, they're not cheap.
Yeah, the other thing just to add to that is I think when we have conversations with anyone, be it local or global, we always try and put like an NDA or a mutual NDA in place as well, just early on, so that when you do start discussions that everything remains confidential. Again, it's very hard to uphold this as well. But yeah, it's something that kind of gives you that peace of mind that you've done it. It's in place, so you can share your ideas outside of your local network.
And just as a reminder, Mary, I mean, anyone listening, if you do have more questions, especially when it comes to regulations and global market expansion, Amrit and Jagdeep also, in addition to the Mantraverse, also run the startup hubs. So it's worth having a look or stopping by, as you can really get even more the advice, especially if you have the opportunity to talk about your own personal scenario on a 1-to-2 basis or even more. So thank you so much, Amrit and Jagdeep. It's been such an amazing show. And for people who want to find out more about what you do and the Mantraverse, what should they do next?
I think, have a look at the website. We do everything from sort of advisory and strategy work to designing products to developing them and delivering them. And we work in many different industries and verticals, so we're happy to help. We have a website, it's www.mantraverse.co. And find us on LinkedIn as well, and feel free to ask any questions. And as Nelly mentioned, we do have another company called the Startups Hub, where we actually mentor startups. And because it can be a very lonely journey, especially if you're on your own. So what we found is that, when you find the right people to give you sound advice, it can actually save you a lot of time, money, and costly mistakes as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And for those who are listeners to this show, do remember that we are going to continue with the FinTech theme for the month. So next week we have yet another startup that are building great product in the FinTech world. So do keep a watch on that as well. Thanks, Amrit and Jagdeep. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I'm sure that the three of us, we can continue for for a while. But thank you again for the valuable advice that you've shared with our audience. And to everybody out there, do remember, let's design a happy and productive workplace playground together.